All right, Fredrick the Great. Whew. So, my history with this one has not been terribly good. Previously, the lack of a campaign has always been one of the major telling points against it. But there's more than that. It has to do with the maneuvering, the way that the game plays out. Something feels very off to me, and it still does. Although I had a great deal more fun this time than I ever have playing it before because of the Balkan Campaign. The game's always felt like, oh look, I'm playing out 1 year. Maybe kind of part of the problem that I have with One by the Sword. Look, I'm playing a year, so what? It doesn't do it for me. I want a frame to hang the individual campaigns on, and at least some level of diplomacy and whatever, even if it's very, very limited. So like in this game, the diplomacy is pretty much limited to the first action in that game. Sorry about wandering off, but my battery is not charging. And I'm going to need it, I fear. So, I guess there's two sides to this to talk about. And although what I should be doing is discussing the game first, what I want to discuss first, because I've always got to go for something less relevant than what you want to hear, is the Balkan Campaign. So, the campaign itself feels like it's kind of patched together, and in some ways there's a similarity between the game and the campaign in the sense that yeah, maybe, but I'm not sure I buy it, So the campaign has this concept of one-time diplomacy when the reality is at least one nation switched sides, and the whole sort of gestalt was kind of in a position where maybe you could have seen a reversal the same way as you did between the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. Maybe. Unlikely, but maybe. Where you might have seen a realignment happen in the midst of this if things happened the wrong way. Now, you can still cast that in the light of, we have this Austro-Prussian war, even though that's not the main event that's, fueling the conflict. And oh boy, am I looking forward to the GMT Twilight struggle in this era. Very much so. But I'm okay with sort of fixed alliances to begin with, but it does feel like other nations should be able to be brought into the game as you go. There shouldn't just be a single diplomacy phase at the end of the 1756 campaign if it happens. There should be more going on, but okay, that's fine. Some other things that feel weird though, the force commitment. I don't mind it for the neutrals, how they're kind of random. That feels right, random's good, but the idea of the players kind of playing, it's not even really a guessing game, because I think naturally the best thing to do is actually just take all your forces at the beginning and hope you can win with them. You might end up getting screwed though by doing that. I'm not absolutely certain, but that's where my initial gut impulse was, and my play of the game didn't tend to indicate that using only part of your force pool was a positive factor. So it might be better to just throw all your troops down point-wise. And since Fredrick the Great allows you to coin counters, and this doesn't set any kind of force limit that I saw on the Prussians and the Austrians, they can basically put down an infinite number of pieces, or however many they can produce. You might be able to get more forces overall if you go for a low conflict. If you increment your forces, you might be able to get sort of a compounding interest off of it. But I think chances are you're going to lose more forces than you gain by doing that. So, just because if the other guy throws all his forces on the board, he's going to try to slaughter you and make it so that you can't get your percentages back from that. The randomized leaders are so important in Fredrick the Great that the randomized leaders ends up being a pretty high luck factor in the campaign as a whole. Of course, so can the diplomacy table. Hanover didn't come in. Well, choosing to go after Saxony may have guaranteed that. The victory conditions, they seem pretty fair, certainly conquering your enemy should be a pretty significant victory. And then the idea of taking 4 out of 5 key cities and having a significant advantage on the overall points of cities, that seems like a reasonable mechanism for the victory conditions. The end of the campaign victory conditions also seem fair in terms of hey, you have certain goals in Silesia because you're going for a more limited victory at that point, and you have the majority of the points. So, it focuses the final campaign back on Silesia, where it kind of makes sense that it would end up. All right. That's about all I really have to say about this grand campaign, though, is that, it's something that sticks the game together, sticks the scenarios together, and as far as that goes, I'm real happy that it's there. It made the game a lot more pleasant for me than what I'm used to it being, which is, that did not work well. The sheets of paper are too big for the box. They fit in there before, but whatever. Okay, let's go on to the core game. So, it's kind of hard to say because to get at the root of what bothers me with it. So you have this kind of fluidity of the forces. You're not building, solid lines the way that you are in something like the Marlborough Wars that I have, the Spanish Succession, and I don't know. I can't remember the names of all. Queen Anne's War, which one's that? Is that Spanish Succession? I don't know. The War of Jenkins' Ear. But Chambers of Reunion, I think that's earlier, actually. But anyway, the wars of Louis and then going into the Marlborough period, etc. You have a much more sort of stately progression of capturing the fortresses and trying to break river lines and stuff like that. On the other hand, the 7 Years' War was much more a war of rapid maneuvers, and I think this game kind of captures some of that. It captures it. It's similar to the kind of rapid maneuvers you start seeing in the Napoleonic Wars, but if anything, the forces kind of stay together even more, I think, in the Fredrick period, and this game actually does sort of handle that. You don't see, for example, abilities to cordon off a river and prevent the enemy from crossing it very well. On the other hand, attacking the enemy across the river should be a problem. If you have to go out of your way to avoid him, that is actually a factor. And I don't feel like that that aspect is as well captured as it should, but you trying to implement that kind of role in something so simple, in so simple a rule set, might end up giving you a game that was anachronistic in terms of how the force deployments end up. You might end up with a more Napoleonic deployment, or worse, a Spanish succession style deployment of forces. Obviously, the actual tactical battlefield, that doesn't come down in a sense that really speaks to me from the system. I'm not seeing linear combat or anything like that, but I'm not sure I expect to in a game at this scale. Okay. But that amount of mobility that's present, and the sort of ability to just sort of slip by your enemy and go do something, but you can't really complete it unless you deal with your enemy. You have to get your enemy out of the way, one way or another, by demoralizing him or whatever, to be able to go forward and besiege your cities and take what you need to. You need to get that field army out of the way. That feels right in some ways, but when I actually see the maneuvers take place on the board, they don't. It's like, oh look, there's an exposed depot back there. I'm gonna run over there and grab it. That just, I don't know why that doesn't feel right. Even more, what doesn't feel right to me is this concept of, I can't attack someone on my own turn if they don't want to fight. They'll withdraw. Which actually, in some ways, makes a lot of sense. But they don't have the option to withdraw on their turn. There's no retreat before combat type roll or anything like that for them. If they're up there facing me, they are offering battle, and they don't have any option to fall back in that condition. And that feels a little weird. I'm not quite sure how to handle that in an I go, you go type game. I mean, obviously, other games handle it with, the ability to force march away and stuff like that. But in a lot of ways, this feels kind of like the Zucker games in terms of this sort of what you can do on your turn is still significantly different from what you can do on your opponent's turn. In both cases, you have a certain degree of reactiveness. But in this game, it feels even more underlined as this sort of, if you're sticking around in the area, I can hit you. And you don't have that option to fall back. So you can't sort of fluidly defend, and present a front and then fall back from it. And there's so little defensive terrain because of river lines and such not being utilized that it just feels maybe a little too fluid for these cumbersome armies of the Age of Reason. At least that's kind of the impression that I get from it. The Grenzers, rather than forcing the Prussians, the way they work with just increasing the zone of control of the Austrian force. They're not called out as Grenzers in here, but they don't feel like light raiding troops that you have to commit more forces to defend your supply line with. In fact, the fact that the whole enemy army can just kind of skirt around you and go step on your supply line and you have no reaction to it. Your only reaction to defend your supply line is sit right on the depot that you need to get off of to do what you want to do. It feels like you have no capacity to maneuver around and try to block your enemy from getting at your supply line. Your only choices are sit in a static location on your supply line, or wait until your opponent moves, is near you, and then hit him, and defeat him in a battle. You have no opportunity to kind of screen and force him to push you away from something. Now, the sieges seem to work okay in the sense that, like, the enemy can move forward. If you're sieging a city, the enemy moves forward, you have the choice. Do you want to leave the siege, or do you want to stay with it? And that's a perfectly reasonable choice. But to me, there's just not this option of blocking the enemy from interfering with your supply line at all, which I found a little disturbing, to say the least. And the Grenzer opportunities to screw with supply lines, yeah, I used that once in the early part of the game, where basically I couldn't get to the depot and just destroy it. So I could slip the Austrian army into a location where it made it impossible for the Prussians to draw a supply, and it broke their siege because of it. But in doing all of this, some of which feels very unnatural and incorrect, you get some of the aspects of that war of maneuver that I don't know how you'd capture in a different sort of way. Which, just feels a little weird to me. It's like, yeah, I don't like what it's doing, but it's kind of like with Maria, I'm not sure what it's doing is completely wrong, The actual combat. So I had worries when I started reading what other people said about the game, that, like, oh look, Fredrick can go in with, like, a small force and kick ass and not lose battles. And it's true. Because of the way the percentage combat works, he might win a battle that he's outnumbered in. But if you're outnumbered and you don't have a ready supply of additional forces to keep funneling into your army, eventually your army attritions away. So pure numbers do matter. And it's quite possible that, first of all, if you get to, 400% or whatever, which isn't that much, somebody can just overrun you. And the chart gets kind of dangerous when you get to the high end of it, where you just capture the enemy anyway, no matter what. The siege combat feels a little skewed as well. Like I said, the sieges make sense. What I'm talking about is the external, the threats from outside on a siege. But when you're actually sieging something, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me that, we breached the city, we breached the walls, and now I have this initial choice. The defender must ask for honors of war. They must evacuate the city. Okay. It's an abstraction, but okay. If the attacker doesn't give them the honors, then they have the option to surrender. But if they don't surrender, it comes down to, we slaughter the entire, the smaller force is destroyed and the larger force takes 100% of the smaller force's losses. That does not represent the siege combats of the era. It might work well when there's a small garrison, but it just doesn't make sense with larger garrisons. And in fact, if you could establish a siege works around a city and blockade the city in, now the defender has the option basically to sortie out and fight, or they will starve to death eventually. And there's no siege attrition, there's nothing like that going on in here. So that, there should be an option to say, you know what, I got the breach, you didn't want to, I'm not going to give you honors of war, you're not going to surrender, so I'm just going to stay here and last you out, and you have to fight. I feel like that could be removed with one simple thing, but that would make sieges of small garrisons too painful, which is that if a fortress is under siege, it's not considered in supply. You can kind of tweak that and say the last strength point can't be destroyed that way, so that you actually have to breach the city to get in there. Of course, that takes away the possibility of an assault that actually could cause massive damage to the attacker, which is the assault without the massive breach. And that should be in place. Demoralization. Demoralization, when you first look at the rules and start thinking about it, it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal, but it really is. It doesn't affect the direct combat results. But, and to some extent it should, a force that's demoralized, that's under attack, should be more likely to break. But after those direct casualty results are added, the who broke does actually come into play. So because a good leader will add his initiative to the amount of losses he causes, which means that if you've got a demoralized Fredrick or something, it's a much, much weaker force. Now, if you have a demoralized Claremont force, it's not that big a deal to be demoralized. Is that okay? Well, it's all right, because you probably don't want to be going into combat with leaders without a good initiative. You really want that high initiative value so that you can break the enemy, and you demoralize him and you capture some of his forces. And for the scenarios in the game, the forces that you capture are an important part of your victory points. Each casualty you cause, even through attrition and something like that, counts as victory points. So for the actual scenarios, the victory point totals are determined by that. For the campaign actually catches that nicely. You don't want to lose strength points because you need them for the next campaign, and you need them to grow your army and everything, and they're more important than they would seem. They're not just strength points you're losing, but they're production you're losing, which, again, in the campaign I have weird thoughts about, my production should not be based on the size of my current army in any sense that, I don't need that much cadre, right? That's what it comes down to. If the Prussian army is destroyed, that doesn't necessarily affect the manpower that I'm able to throw back in the field. But if you start talking about quality and stuff like that, you're looking at a different situation. So I don't know. The winter rules, if you want to push a winter campaign, it's going to cost you. And in this particular scenarios, you really kind of have to look and say, do I want to pay 1 strength point per force that I have in the field per turn? If you're going to take a fortress, it's going to be worth 5 or 10 points, probably. But if you're not sure you're going to take that fortress, if it doesn't seem clear that your siege is going to work, then there's kind of a real cost-benefit analysis to take place there. So, what's kind of weird is I mentioned there's another game out there. It is indeed a 3W game that looks a lot like this. I don't remember the movement in combat working quite like this at all. I think it's more traditional. And playing that got me more in the mood for this at one point. And then I went back to this, maybe, and said, geez, I don't remember this being so screwy. Because there's something very, very weird about the way the movement in combat. Basically, how weird is the movement? I like the fact that you're rolling a die for movement. I like the fact that, you don't know what your movement's going to be. I especially like the force march movement where you're rolling a die for each force, and you might be saying, well, I need to move this force first, see if it gets into combat, and then try to bring another one into play. Forces are easy to coordinate in this, maybe too easy, because you can almost always pick, well, yeah, because with force marches you get to pick which force you want to, which force you want to roll for first. You don't have a limitation on that. And for the regular movement, you have a single die roll, and you know how far all of your forces can move. One thing I definitely find is weird is, oh look, I never want to roll for, unless I really have to, unless the payoff's high, I generally don't want to roll for Fredrick to force march, because he has too high an initiative, and he'll lose too many forces. Now, it makes sense if I want to force march far, that maybe I'm taking more risk. But if I don't want to force march terribly far, I'm not sure that it really makes sense that the attrition would work as it does. And again, I like how War and Peace's attrition works better, where it's how far you move that impacts your attrition value, not how good at being able to move that a particular leader is. But I can see arguments, in the sense that, well, those other designs don't get it right either, and that greater activity and everything might put more of a strain on the army overall. I can see the arguments. I can see where the other games with more traditional designs end up kind of putting you in this position of a different kind of gaminess. This one, though, just kind of throws you this huge curveball. If you're used to your standard war games, even ones that came after this and are kind of, that owe some of their existence to this, and War and Peace probably is one of those, you kind of look at it and you say, well, those make more sense, but they still have a flaw, and this one kind of avoids that flaw by putting a different one in. It's almost like this alien branch that's come off from this game, and it caused other things to flower along the main line, and to change, but they kind of went the wrong way too. It just went different wrong ways. I don't know quite how to express it. It's really hard to put my finger on this one. As a gaming experience, I think this one's very, very interesting. It throws all kind of puzzles and curves to you that you're not used to seeing in your normal hex encounter war game. But I'm not sure that I don't think that those are more accurate, by any means, are more accurate simulations. I don't think that this is a particularly accurate simulation, for example. I think the others that go into more details, etc., following that main line can find those details better. You can't really make this more detailed, I don't think. It just feels so alien that it's hard to tell whether I'm, just going with this gut reaction. But it doesn't feel like you can make this terribly more detailed, yet somehow by adding details to those more traditional systems. If you take the more traditional system to begin with and branch that off of this, what you get is kind of this, okay, it doesn't really work better than this. But then as you add the details and layers to it, it feels like it's working better and better. With something like War and Peace or something. The interception rolls, all the different kinds of actions that are in there just feel like they handle things a little bit more accurately, a little bit more believably. When you start adding things like firepower tables, where you're doing percentages of losses to the enemy based on your size, not, oh look, this tiny force couldn't take many losses, therefore it defeated me. Why couldn't it take more losses? That doesn't make sense to me. I have more force, I have more capability to come from directions. Well, maybe not with linear combat, right? Maybe this deployment means that I can't afford quite as much flanking opportunity as I see in the Napoleonic era. I don't know. That's kind of the argument I think that tries to go in favor of this, is that this is such... the game tries to express something that feels like this is such a different style of warfare that we should highlight these facets about it. And those facets exist, and I don't think they're well addressed by more traditional games, but it almost feels to me that this game goes too far in that direction and creates something that's just so alien that it's hard to grasp. Now, if you do grasp it, if you do kind of capture how to play this game better, you may become very, very good at this. But I'm not sure that you have a better view of what the Age of Reason combat on a strategic or operational level really is like. I feel like you get an equally or maybe even more twisted and perverse view of things. But there's a fun challenge in this, and I certainly see that. And you throw me that kind of chaotic, obviously also equally wrong campaign in there, and I'm just like, whoa, man, I've got these decisions and I'm not sure I'm making the right one, but it seems to me it would make more sense to just throw all my strength in there, right? Yeah, so I'm kind of bumbling around trying to grasp this game and trying to understand, what it's trying to do. Is it just... is it a gaminess that really kind of does indeed, and this is what it feels like, strip away the simulation value more, but is it so interesting in that sense that it creates something? And that's kind of the feeling that I get with the Maria and the Fredrick is, I don't understand what some of this shit is doing, like the cards and stuff, but it is capturing some things that other game designs that follow the more traditional design techniques from the time just didn't manage well from the time for this. And I think this kind of does something in a similar sort of way, which is like, what the fuck, man? What's going on here? And that's just how I feel, is that I've got something that's almost orthogonal to reality, but maybe not that much further away from it than the more traditional designs would be for this. So I don't know. Cheers. And yeah, we're going to move to a different era after this.